I'll give you a signal when we're going to start. Good afternoon on this BC Day long weekend. And here at the monastery, also the Chram, or Slava, feast day of the monastery, the Theotokos, the Joy of Canada, for which our church here is named. And we have quite a few guests from various places staying with us, as far away as Virginia and Chicago and a place called Iowa, and from Edmonton, as usual. And we have the good fortune to have my colleague David Goa from the Chester Ronning Center of the University of Alberta. And I'm going to interview him about some of the things going on currently in the world, because the Chester Ronning Center is particularly interested in the intersection, and sometimes the collision, between religion and civil society. And so David is a perfect person to speak to us a little bit about some of the events and happenings that have gone on in Canada and other parts of the world where civil society and religious interest or religious charity happen to intersect with one another. And David, I noticed that there are two things that have happened. Was a little bit of complaint because the present government had been financing some certain religious charities, and this past year sort of shifted from ones that had traditionally been financed and didn't offer a grant to them this year, and instead offered a grant to certain other charities. And I think it has something to do with the intersection with civil society as well, and I wonder if you could reflect on that for us.
I suppose the major example that you're referring to had to do with, in September 1909, Kairos.
2009.
I guess you're right, 2009, not 1909. I am getting older. Kairos, which is a large ecumenical NGO. Are you part of Kairos?
Mm-hmm.
It involves Roman Catholics, Anglicans, Lutherans, Presbyterians, a number of churches, as well as some interchurch organizations. Kairos is a major church-related or faith-based NGO in Canada. I think it's fair to say that Kairos would usually be seen as on the more liberal end of the church. They've been funded through CEDA, the Canadian International Development Agency of the federal government. They've been funded for, I think, over 25 years. You know, they've had a long record of doing work, and they've done a really wide range of work. Work with the poor in a variety of countries, work around refugees, work around environmental issues, a really large range of work. And it's been fairly routine for them to fill out their application form for funding, and for that to be walked through the bureaucracy, and for them to receive funding. And their funding has been pretty substantial. You know, it's been millions of dollars. Well, I mean, what happened, for those that are unfamiliar with it, is that they did this in the usual manner after Mr. Harper's government was elected. And the process went in the usual manner through the bureaucracy. And it was signed off by the key people that monitor the funding agency, and sent to the minister for the minister's final signature. And after several days, the minister made an announcement that it was the Honorable Bev Oda, that she was not going to fund Kairos this year. And then the government sort of circled the wagons around this issue. And finally, when the document came out, they discovered that it had been signed by the bureaucracy. The funding had been signed. They'd met all the standards. but that there was a line through a word, and they inserted not, will not be funded. And so there was this question about, sort of a process question, about who wrote that not there, and where did this decision actually come from? Did it come from the minister? Now, technically, the minister has the right to do this. It's highly unusual for the minister to allow a process to go all the way through the bureaucracy and then put the kibosh to it. But in any case, that's what happened in this case. So it created a bit of a scandal, and people tried to get at what actually happened here. Was it the bureaucracy that was saying no? Was there something wrong with the application? Was it Minister Oda herself? Or did this come from the Prime Minister's office? And of course, we don't really know. I had a student do some research on this, and she did a great job outlining the whole schedule of events around it and what have you. In any case, I spent a little time on Parliament Hill around this period and heard a little bit about this application. What was clear to me is that our government under the Prime Minister, it has taken into its inner circle a different group of people from the group of people that were in the inner circle of the Liberal Party. This is not surprising. There's nothing new in this. If you elect a new government, they're going to have new people in their inner circle, and they're going to do things a bit differently. Well, as I read this story and watched as it unfolded, it seemed to me that one of the things we were seeing was our government beginning to pull back on the funding of what was seen by many as religious-based NGOs, but they're on the liberal wing of the church and on the liberal wing of politics. So one of the things I asked my student, which was curious because I didn't know what would result from this, I asked her to see if she could find out where CEDA's money had gone in that grant cycle. Now you would think in Canada that you could actually find that out. You would think that that would be published immediately as soon as the grants were lent. But in fact you can't find it out except through freedom of information process, which takes quite a long time. I would not be surprised, I mean we don't know, but I would not be surprised if the same amount of money has gone to faith-based NGOs for various purposes around the world, but it's gone to a different set of them. Now, certainly one of the things that's happened in our country is that there has developed quite a number of new faith-based NGOs and faith-based universities and think tanks and what have you. This has happened, this process has been underway for some time, but it got a real boost from the Prime Minister's, after the Prime Minister's first election. I don't know if you recall, but the Prime Minister, one of the first acts was to change the tax law so that people could donate to charitable organizations. They could donate stocks and bonds. They could donate some of their investments, and they would then be free of capital gains tax on it. And this almost went without people noticing. But I'm well aware of the fact that this was done through the direct lobby of a number of the religious organizations that realized there would be tremendous advantage to their organizations if they could get access to this kind of funding from a variety of its supporters. Now, that funding is available to any institution. The university I'm part of has benefited from that. All kinds of people have benefited from it. But I think the intention was to see that it could benefit these faith-based organization. So one of the interesting things to me is when you see this happen, you look at an organization like Kairos, which has existed for a long time, has a long track record, but has a particular kind of perspective out of which they work. And then you look at a number of these other NGOs, which also have their perspective, but their perspective is different. We used to say, I don't know if you used to say this, but I know in my part of the church we used to say this, there are people in the church that want to do charity, and there are people in the church that want to do justice, and never the twain shall meet. My own sense is that this is a tragic way of cutting up the pie. Triage needs to be done, charity needs to be done, but the works of justice need to be done as well. It has been typical in Canada for many of the evangelical churches to be quite deeply engaged in charitable work, but to view the work associated with what we would call justice, that is any kind of systemic analysis of poverty or the whole range of other things, that is really becoming way too political, and the church shouldn't be doing that. Now, I'm not sure that still holds. I mean, I don't think the case is in yet, but there have been such changes taking place in some of the evangelical wings of the church that they're beginning to get interested in some of these justice issues as well, and they're beginning to do things there also. But in this particular case, Kairos had this huge amount of funding wiped out without any kind of indication that this might be a problem. And in the responses to why this was done, which took a great deal of effort, a great deal of lobbying to find out why, finally there were a few things that surfaced. One of them was the Honorable Jason Kenney, who is responsible for a number of portfolios in the government, who is himself a Roman Catholic, and the Catholic bishops are on Kairos. But he made a speech in the wake of this at an organization that is concerned with Israel and which lobbies on behalf of Israel and is also concerned with anti-Semitism. And in his speech, he did make reference to Kairos and to the fact that the government had decided it was no longer going to fund some of these organizations, such as Kairos, which he suggested are organizations that do not represent the best interests of Israel. Now, Kairos has spoken very clearly about Israel. Kairos has, as part of its policy, a kind of support, certainly for the state of Israel. It's not against the state of Israel. But what Kairos has done is it has reached into the Palestinian communities. It has seen the issue with the Palestinians as being very grave and needing to be something that we respond to. As Christians, we need to respond to this unbelievable situation that has come to exist with the Palestinians. So a number of analysts have suggested that part of what's going on here is cutting the feet out from under Kairos because, among other things, because it had gotten just a bit too interested in the Palestinian cause.
Yeah, that's one of the problems that we've seen is religious ideology injecting itself in place of the faith itself, in a political way, because to try to treat everyone in somewhat of an equal basis, it's so often interrupted by a political ideology or sense, and the idea that perhaps Palestinians should be treated as human beings who are suffering is unacceptable from the point of view of Christian Zionism, even more than amongst a lot of Jews who want to see the Palestinians treated with some justice. And that this kind of an ideology has kind of crept in. But it seems that the kind of right-wing ideology that we're seeing in this particular case is really growing across the world and coming into conflict and creating more conflict. There's a right-wing movement in Europe against the Islamic populations, but there's a right-wing movement in Islam that wants to expand this. And even in Egypt today, we see that the Islamic right-wing Islam, conservative Islam, is trying to hijack the revolution in Egypt and move toward forming an Islamic republic, similar to something in Iran or something. And that they're very well prepared for the coming election, whereas the people who want democracy and human civil rights are not very well prepared for the election. And that there seems to be a kind of a movement that is bound to come to some kind of a collision sooner or later between the religious right in, at least nominally, Christian West, and the religious right in Islam, both of which are trying to have completely different objectives, but both are motivated fundamentally, and that's not a pun, but anyway, fundamentally by the same perspectives, but they're just in the opposite, on opposite sides, but the perspectives aren't, it seems to me they're not radically different.
And similar methods at times are at work. I mean, you mean by similar objectives, they both want to have the civil state come on side with their ideas in a more precise way to knit this closer together.
Yeah, it's something like the religious right movement in the States, while they themselves probably don't even realize it, what they really want is a theocracy instead of a democracy. They want a republic, but a republic is a theocracy, or to some one degree or another. That you want the state itself to follow your particular religious doctrine and try to make that the legal norm in the country, in a way that radical Islam or the right wing in Islam want Sharia law to prevail over civil law, over and above civil law. And it seems that there are Christian movements that are equal in their intention.
One of the things that troubles me about this whole thing is looking back, I suppose, just a bit behind that. Like, how does that come about? And no doubt there's distinct histories here as to how that comes about, depending on the country and the religious tradition we're looking at. But there's some common features in the 20th century that I think, in order to understand this and to figure out particularly what to do about it, we need to think carefully about. If we look at Egypt, and again, I don't know a great deal about it, but I know a little bit about it. In Egypt, you had a fairly thoroughgoing secular government, similar to, also if we look at Syria, you and I were together in Syria, and where you have the Ba'athist government in Syria, and then of course the other great example that we've spent a little bit of time in the presence of is of course Turkey, where you had Ataturk. So in the 20th century there have been these movements which are secular, but which are also pretty virulent. And the model, of course, for this is the French Revolution and the Soviet Union, and the experiment run in the Soviet Union. And I suppose also in China and Burma and places like that. Now, when you have a movement that claims to be secular, but which has this kind of virulence to it, where it is intent on, if not destroying religious leadership, although there's plenty of that that's gone on, certainly seeing that religious leadership is put in a very private space and has absolutely no breathing space of a public nature. If you do that, as has happened in these countries we've mentioned, who's going to be able to organize and do any kind of opposition, or who's going to be able to bring, whether it is the best values from a religious tradition, or even some of those values which, you and I might not think were the best ones, and bring them at least into the public and civil dialogue. Well, it's going to be very difficult to do that, and in many of these cases, nobody was allowed to do that. So you put the lid on that dimension of human culture and of human aspiration. And in the case of Egypt, the people who are able to do that are the Muslim Brotherhood, because they got a running start at this, and they put those institutions together, put those things in place. Now my friend, our friend, the late Ibrahim Abarabi, said to me here just a few weeks ago that in his view, the Muslim Brotherhood has to be understood also in terms of its historical development. Indeed, it was extremely violent in its early iteration. Someone like Osama bin Laden's teacher, Qutb, he was part of it, and I mean, he promulgated this new doctrine in which he argued that not only the modern West, but the leadership in many traditionally Muslim countries was Jalaliya, were pagans, and that for that reason, one had every right to deal with them in this dramatic and cavalier way. Well, we know what happened to him. He lost his head in Egypt in the 60s because that simply wasn't on. But Ibrahim said that the Muslim Brotherhood has gone through changes, and it would be inappropriate to view them that way now. They do have a capacity, and they're probably the only ones who have a capacity to organize and what have you at this point. But what that will mean, we don't really know. This is my suggestion to you. Just as I don't think in Turkey we know yet. Finally Ataturk and Ataturk's way of envisioning things got pushed back. In the propaganda in the West, the news in the West, there was just a piece in the paper this morning about it again. There's all this fear that the government of Turkey is some kind of religious resurgent movement, and the only way you can understand that is through the prism of conservative religious movements, as if the model was Saudi Arabia. Well, that's nonsense. The model isn't Saudi Arabia, and it isn't Iran. There's a variety of things going on here. So I think part of our challenge is to pay real attention to the differences in these matters, to understand that there is always a price to pay anytime you have any kind of virulent government, including a virulent secular government. Look at Russia, look at Serbia, look at Romania in terms of our Orthodox world, and look at the way we care about those things. I mean, you and I are both concerned about what's happening there. On the one hand, you have this virulent government, so those are persecuted churches and persecuted peoples. But once they get some fresh air, once they get the ability to do something and throw off that yoke, what happens? I mean, nobody has spoken about this as forcefully as you have. What happens is you have a few bishops who were martyred or were certainly imprisoned and persecuted, but then you have a bunch of them which weren't. We can't blame them. I mean, I'm not about to blame them for their situation. But when we come out of that, as our bishop friend in Romania said to us, when we come out of that and the bishops immediately, as soon as they have some power, think that they're real estate agents, and they want to seize back the religious power in this direct way in that context. Now, if it happens there, it's surely going to happen in the Muslim world as well. But it seems to me our challenge is to pay attention to that, but also not to assume that that's the only option. You and I have spent time in Turkey. Look at the Nur movement there, Said Nursi's group there. I mean, they're hearing a different drumming. They're doing it differently than that. And we have great examples in Christianity of doing it differently than that. It would be very easy, and it was, if we think ourselves back into the 1960s in the United States, our good neighbor to the south, and re-examine the public media around Dr. Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement. What would you have heard there? Well, some of what you would hear is that this is an attempt This is an attempt to seize the public sphere for a bunch of religious values over against our secular values, which alas, only serve the white folks.
Yeah.
So my sense is it's a textured issue, and it isn't easy to thoroughly figure out. So coming back to Canada, the issue with Kairos is, you know, from my perspective, this is terribly unfortunate. At the same time, there are all these other groups which no doubt are getting funding at this point. We have to remember that governments do change, and when they change, the people that they want to fund are going to be different. The issue is, to what extent do those people, to what extent are they going to be responding to the challenges in our life together in the world out of the heart of the gospel? To what extent are they going to be challenged? Or to what extent are they going to use those issues simply for building their institutions and building their bureaucracies?
Yeah, that's, I noticed in some of the responses to our broadcast on YouTube, I've gotten several requests to, as one person phrased it, expose the falsehood of Islam, or say something, you know, how to defend ourselves against Islam, or one of the heresies of Islam or something. Well, I have no intention of doing that, but the fact that some people are asking for it, as if we had to have some kind of active adversarial way of responding instead of something a little more civilized in the way of responding.
You know, some of the same people that have said that to me are people that hate secular governments. So I say to them, why do you spend all your time beaten up on secular, what you understand to be the secular government of Canada or the United States? In this context, why don't you realize that there's Muslim movements which have the same problem you have with secular governments? And my own view is that their way of understanding secular governments is deeply problematic. Their way of understanding the religious place in it is deeply problematic.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you know, I'm very much in favor of secular governments. Not virulent secular governments.
Of course.
But I don't want
secular government means freedom of religion, frankly.
Well, that's the whole problem, you see, is that when some of the response to what people imagine to be a secular government and what they think a secular government is, secular governments are not necessarily anti-religious or opposed to religion, but they don't espouse any particular religion so that there can be a freedom within the country.
Of course, yeah.
And without a secular government, you can't have that. And that's one of the problems, is superimposing religious ideologies on social issues that can never be solved once they're moralized. And that major problems that face our whole society can never be dealt with in an appropriate manner if they're dealt with on the basis of religious ideology. And I think of the InSite, the safe injection site, where from a moralistic point of view you want to close it down, even though it saves hundreds of lives and saves tens of thousands of dollars for the healthcare system and provides some kind of humanity and compassion. But because you've moralized it, you can't accept the actual value of it, because if you acknowledge the value of it, then it confuses your concept of absolutism in moralism.
Well, and these people want to be pure.
Yeah.
You know, they want to be pure. They don't want their money going to something that they see as impure. But the challenge there, Vidika, is for us, with our Christian brothers and sisters who have taken that path, our challenge there is to deepen their understanding of their faith so that they will be able to live with what they previously saw as those ambiguities, so that they will no longer think it is necessary for them to be zealous on behalf of their particular notions of the truth, because they know that all of these things must be held in some fashion or another in the presence of the grace of God.
Yep.
And that you've got to figure out how to pull life from things instead of pulling death from them. But that is not anything that ever can be done from a perspective that is in some sense pure. I mean, one of the wonderful things about the gospel and about the church, as I understand her, is that it helps us live real lives in the real tensions that exist, and it helps us engage and be present and act even when we are unsure that it's right. Precisely because forgiveness is at the center of our faith, not purity. So we need to figure out how to deepen those conversations. And I would say that's also the case with the little bit that we've been doing in the Muslim world. I mean, many places in the Muslim world are undergoing the tremendous demands and trials of entering modern life. Not everywhere, many of them have already entered. But in many places, the big struggle here is the struggle to become modern. Well, my Lord, that is a painful struggle. And we ought to have lots of compassion for it, because it took Western Europe, which created the phenomena, 300 years to live through it, and it was unbelievably painful. So we need to be compassionate about it, but we also need to strike friendships. I mean, the people, the Christians that ask you that, how to out Islam or speak about its heresies or what have you, what they need to understand is that we have a quite singular call from our faith. We are called to spiritual friendship with everyone, and certainly with Muslims. And certainly in this period, this horrific period for so many Muslims in the world, we are called to spiritual friendship with them, and that means not being fearful. If we're fearful, then we have to define ourselves over against. Why do you have to do that? That's obvious. The differences are obvious. But the differences aren't the point in our relationships with other people. What is the point is helping other people and ourselves figure out how to live this complex world in a bit more human way, and in a way that is more of a blessing and can lead to healing and lead to fullness, instead of shoving people back into some kind of a box that we've defined.
Yeah. I always remember, we discussed before the commentary, and in a way, I remember one Jewish colleague telling me that if the Jews had understood the Old Testament, well, they wouldn't call it the Old Testament law, if the Jews had understood the law the same way Christians do, the last Jew would have had to stone himself to death. But they didn't work out that way. And remember the commentary that says if the high priest is on his way to the temple to serve the reconciliation liturgy, I guess Yom Kippur, isn't it? And he has to be,
the Day of Atonement.
He has to be in a state of complete purity,
right,
to enter the temple. But if he comes upon a dead body and there's no one to bury it, even though touching the dead body will render him impure, he's to bury the body anyway,
right,
and then go out and serve the liturgy regardless, because the mercy of peace is greater than the law of purity. Yeah. And that's one of the things that a lot of Christians need to reassess, is if a concept of purity overrides a concept of love and compassion, then how can it actually be pure? And that's one of the things that we actually, have to kind of discuss and really come to grips with in a way. And the other thing is that absolute purity is an impossibility for mankind. If we could attain absolute purity ourselves, then Christ would have not necessarily needed the incarnation. But the idea of what purity consists in is often reduced down to a moral code, so that you externally fulfill a law, and that makes you pure. But it has no impact on the heart of the inner person, and no impact on your relationship or your understanding of other human beings who are different than you are. And it seems from a Christ point of view, where he dealt with Samaritans as equals, where he called Samaritans into the kingdom, the Canaanite woman who had a faith born of love. And he made really an exposition of her faith so that others could learn from it, of the power of her faith, which was motivated by her co-suffering love for her child. And how to deal with the other, and realizing ultimately there is no the other, there are only variations on a theme in the great symphony of humanity, that there isn't really the other. Everyone has two eyes, a nose, two nostrils, ears, and everyone has the same pain, the same suffering, the same sorrow, the same joy. Everybody weeps the same kind of tears. And somehow, purity doesn't really have a place. That kind of purity doesn't have a place in it. It's a different kind of purity. And that really is the purity of compassion.
It seems to me, part of our responsibility, and I'm not sure we often, or at least I'm not sure I often act on it in a proper way, is how to respond to men and women who have taken refuge in immoralism, who have taken refuge in a paradigm of purity as they understand it. Because that is a symptom of suffering itself. That is a symptom of suffering. It's a symptom of fear. It's a symptom of the lack of faith. And how to help them understand that what they hope to be valuing through that prism, which is often, in and of itself good things, that they actually could continue to value them, but they could value them as Jesus did. Mm. They could value them also from the perspective of real faith and the real ability to open their heart to other people. Jesus was never less than a moralist and was always more than a moralist. He forgave, as no moralist can, and he also made a demand greater than any moralist would, which is the demand to let go of your fear so that you can actually be, as he was, present to those who are suffering, no matter what they're suffering from, including suffering from the enormous burden of Puritanism.
Yeah.
It's a spiritual disease, and sometimes you and I get mad at them. And we need to also be compassionate to them and figure out, how does this come about? And what can I do to help them move off that dime?
Yeah, that's a very delicate matter in a way, because sometimes when people are, for Christians to be locked into the Old Testament laws of purity so deeply, and I sometimes wonder if the people who think they have to defend God or prove the existence of God, I don't know if they're responding to science or the world, or they're trying to respond to their own inner doubts.
No question.
That they're actually trying to prove to themselves, because they don't actually have a real living faith, that it's a cultural affectation or a cultural faith, or as in the United States, it's your patriotic duty to be religious. Even if you're not, you have a patriotic duty to be religious. And sometimes they're really carrying out all these arguments, trying to reassure themselves that they believe, when they don't actually, or when they have serious doubts about it. It's like, the fact that moral outrage is a form of confession. Anybody who's morally outraged, fixated on any given vice or sin, it's because that's working within them, and they're either desperately self-hating about it, or they're trying to cover up a sort of private life that they have they don't want people to know about. There's something else going on there, because that kind of intensity in moral outrage can only be trying to cover something that's wounded you yourself within yourself. Otherwise we can have moral grief. And moral grief can be healing. Moral outrage is wounding, it's never healing. But moral outrage is a projection of your own inner struggle.
But it comes from the problem.
It comes from the problem.
So how to reach into the problem and anoint the problem.
Sure, we hate most in others. We hate most in others what we fear most in ourselves.
Yeah.
And so there's no room for that. Moral grief is something, if you have moral grief, you grieve over people because they're suffering. If you have moral outrage, you want to destroy people because you think they're impure. And but that's a reflection of your own inner struggle, without any exception that I've ever seen. Moral outrage is a form of confession about what's going on inside yourself. And it's always wounding to you, and it's wounding to the other person. And in the Garden of Gethsemane, as St. Anthony Krapowicki reminds us, Christ suffered more morally over the suffering of mankind and over the bondage of mankind that he suffered on the cross physically. That his greatest suffering was in, and the cup that he wanted to have removed from him was the sheer agony he felt over the suffering of mankind and over the bondage of mankind. And this is really what the Holy Fathers have taught us about the Garden of Gethsemane. The moral suffering of Christ was infinitely worse than the physical suffering he endured, because he took on himself all of the sufferings of mankind and the bondage of mankind and saw them as suffering. Whereas so many of our moralist Christians see them as sin, and they don't see it as suffering, inner human suffering. And realize that these things are to be healed, not persecuted and prosecuted. That the church is not a court of law. The priest is not supposed to be a prosecuting attorney. We're supposed to be spiritual healers. And we can't do that as moralists. We can only do it by realizing what the true meaning of morality is. And the true meaning of morality is to have an infinite empathy for one another. And that's why Christ said to love your neighbor as yourself. The only possible way you can do that is to have an infinite empathy for your neighbor. And that includes Muslims, it includes Hindus, it includes Buddhists, it includes atheists.
And it includes yourself.
And it includes yourself, exactly. That you can never accomplish anything by anger, and even less by fear. The only thing you can accomplish by fear is inspiring people to violence and to malice. And that's why the Apostle said we've not been given over in bondage to a spirit of fear. And the beloved Apostle that whoever still has fear has not yet learned how to love perfectly, because perfect love drives out fear, because fear has torment. And this is the whole dimension of Christianity comes back to Mohandas Gandhi's famous statement that the problem with Christians is they pay no attention to Christ. We're locked into the Old Testament. So many Christians are locked into Old Testament laws, but would never pay attention to Ezekiel and Isaiah saying, the greatest moral sins are that you don't care for the widow, you don't care for the orphan, you don't care for the stranger, you don't care for the poor and the hungry. Those are the greatest of sins that man can commit. And this is something that Christ emphasized over and over and over again, that this is what real morality consists in. And of course, when Christ said that the Sabbath was created for men, not man for the Sabbath, he clearly demonstrated that he was no fundamentalist. And that's very significant to us, that we understand this kind of, that I understand how fundamentalism began, and it was rather laudable in a way, but what it boiled down to when it was reshaped into an ideology, and this is a problem for Orthodox Christians too, that we can shape our belief into an ideology of absoluteness, and then we have no gift or no flexibility or no capacity for the other. And our hearts become closed, hardened, and ossified. And that's a problem that we as Orthodox Christians have to face just like everyone else.
My sense is that there are relatively few people that are moralists in this extreme way, and that they are probably suffering from mental illness.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, but the problem is they get given a certain kind of status by churches, and even within our culture they get a lot of press and what have you, because their position is so clear. To say the best of our.
Yeah, to say the best.
But the tragedy is that they garner people around them, and they create these sort of small traditions around this. So, you know, I've thought a lot about this and about how does one address that. I mean, an extreme example would be, what does one do with people, you know, in the Muslim community, young people who become deeply attracted to militant Islam? Like, how do you respond to that? My own sense is you probably cannot change the mind of Osama bin Laden or of major leaders within those kinds of virulent movements, any more than you could change the mind of Jerry Falwell. You know, you can't, I mean, there are some people that are beyond that. I mean, whatever is going on here, it's in some ways unreachable. But I'm absolutely convinced you can change the heart
of their disciples, even if you don't change their mind. And but you know what we have to do? What we have to do with it is you have to understand their religious tradition better than their leader does.
Yeah.
And you have to pull forward the aspiration that they had only framed in this decadent way. And pull that aspiration forward. So in the case of the kind of moralists you talk about, if we recognize that this is a manifestation of suffering, that when people respond this way, it's because they really do not have faith. They don't have faith. This isn't a stance of faith, because faith is a disposition of the mind of openness to the way in God's kingdom is coming to greet us in everything in life. So they don't have that. So that's suffering. If we see it as suffering and don't take it upon ourselves to challenge the leader, let's just assume the leader is beyond the pale. But see the disciples and others that surround them as not being beyond the pale, and doing the kind of work with them out of the heart of the best of their tradition. The little bit that I have done this has been amazing to me, because what happens is they suddenly realize that they actually can have a better and richer and more life-giving faith than the simulacrum they've been offered by their neurotic leader.
Yeah, I've noticed that this really has been a problem within the Orthodox world, with a kind of guru cultism that we have.
Of course, yeah.
A lot of people have gone to Mount Athos and they find a florid schizophrenic who then sets their complete spiritual agenda for them, because florid schizophrenics are very, very religious.
And they're
very
attractive.
wise and very spiritual. And they're very convincing. And this is one of the problems with elder cultism. I mean, okay, we have spiritual elders in the church. We also have people that Patriarch Alex say labored very long and very hard to undo this kind of spiritual cultism that grew up around these sort of magic elders. And but the thing is that their spiritual agendas are so destructive. I mean, I meet people in Greece who married people with family who have been given a prayer rule in the evening where you have to abandon your children in order to fulfill the prayer rule. That you have no time for your children at all, because you have to do 1,000 prayer ropes, just knots. Swinging knots, as if swinging knots somehow magically made you holy. And you have to do so many prostrations, and if you fail to fulfill it one night, you have to add it to the next nights and make it up. And the children become bitter and angry, and they despise the church because the church has robbed them of their parents, of the relationship with their parents. And there's far too much of this in the Orthodox Church, where a person becomes a priest and they think they're a spiritual father. So they tell people they're a spiritual father.
So Vedika, when you have a situation like that, the florid schizophrenic monk, you're not going to be able to deal with that.
No, you can't.
He's a guru, he's living in his own world, people are going to be attracted to that. But the people who are attracted to it, how do we engage them?
Yeah, that's the thing.
How do we engage them? Do we engage them by threatening their relationship to their spiritual elder?
Right.
I suspect that that's probably not the gate to enter.
No.
Do we engage them by exploring with them what their spiritual journey has been, why that elder is attractive to them, giving some space for that to be expressed, and then seeking the wonderful ointment of the gospel and bringing it into their situation. In many of these cases, I think people would be unbelievably relieved to know that they have become infatuated based on deep aspirations, which are themselves holy, but they have been twisted. So how to undo that twist? It seems to me to be always a great challenge to figure out. Can one hear what is behind what's happened here, And can one draw on the richness of our tradition? I mean, you've spent your whole life doing this, so I mean, this isn't news to you. Can we draw on the tradition in some way so that they can be freed to their aspiration, instead of their aspiration being colonized for the psychopathic needs of somebody else?
Yeah, it's like a priest who calls himself somebody's spiritual father. And you can't be a spiritual father unless you've been a priest at least 25 years. And even then it's dubious. You know, you have to be almost an old age before you can do that, because you don't have the experience, nor do you have the spiritual growth. But throwing this title...
And you still have too much ego.
And you still have far too much. All of us do. I mean, I was never allowed anybody to call me a spiritual father. I haven't begun to be qualified to be a spiritual father. And maybe in another 10 years if I'm still alive. But it's just that this word is so cheapened. And then we form a cult of the personality around a parish priest because he says he's a spiritual father. He's not a spiritual father. First place, fatherhood demands that we want people to be better than we are, to accomplish more than we've accomplished. Not that we want to subvert them to ourselves and make them totally dependent on us. So we actually emotionally cripple them so that they become dependent on us. And then, oh, I have to see my spiritual father. What brand of toilet paper should I have to get a blessing from my spiritual father? It gets to that point. And that's a tragedy within the Orthodox world. We're more susceptible to that than any other Christian group, in a way. And it's something...
Why is that?
Well...
I've wondered about that. Why do you think that is?
Because we read so much ascetic literature, and we take the lives of the saints as if they were part of the sacred tradition, and they're not. They're not part of the sacred tradition of the Church at all. There is no doctrine that you can form from the lives of the saints. For one thing, we don't even know who wrote most of them. We have no idea what the source of them is.
They're great testimonies of suffering as well.
Yeah, and some of them are a little bit outrageous.
Well, they're the psychological handbook of the Church.
Yeah.
They're the case studies.
The case studies, yeah. But the thing is that, well, you know, Father Michael Pomazanski at Holy Trinity, at the seminary at Jordanville, made this point that the ancient martyrologies, where we have some actual records, are part of the tradition of the Church. The lives of the saints are simply inspirational reading. But some people take them as if they were Holy Scripture. And that's one of the ways that we get into this. And I dare say that converts are more likely to do that than people born in the faith, because this is something new to them, and it seems to be something that's so imperative that they don't realize what's, you know, the difference in what's being said.
Of course, the nice thing nowadays is that there's virtually nobody born into the faith.
Well, yeah.
Oh, come on.
No, I'm saying that. People who come out of communist...
Just because you got Russian blood doesn't mean you're born into the faith.
No, people who come out of the communist world know even less. But, I mean, let me give you an example, though, is that St. Anthony the Great says that the demons beat him.
Yeah.
Right, okay, in the West, they understood that as physically.
Yeah.
We know very well that demons can't do anything physically.
Yeah.
He meant that they wounded him spiritually. All of his wounds and all of his beatings were spiritual. Nothing to do with anything physical. So there's a whole different understanding here that separates our whole vision of the life of St. Anthony.
Sure.
And that's something that we have to relearn, how to read the lives of the saints in an Orthodox perspective, and realize that some of it's formulaic and some of it's iconographic,
sure,
verbal iconography, and some of it didn't happen that way at all, but it's a metaphor for something, and not take it, you know. So a lot of this idea that there's a separate ascetic theology as opposed to the theological theology in the Church, and the idea that you can't be saved without a guru, without a spiritual elder. Well, if that were the case, then practically nobody would just give up and go away if you can't find somebody who can walk on water. But this is to make people independent, spiritually alert, spiritually aware people. Any true father wants his children to be able to come to maturity and be independent of him,
right,
so that they can carry on and think for themselves.
You don't want to infantilize them.
No, of course not. You don't want to.
But what you're saying is that there are people that take the title spiritual father and are engaged in infantilizing their disciples.
And crippling their disciples so that they're constantly dependent. And that's not fatherhood. That's not parenthood of any kind. That's like a neurotic, overbearing parent who wants to control and manipulate their children well, and control and manipulate their marriage after they get married. And that's completely irresponsible, and it's not part of actual tradition of the faith. So we have a problem as well. And I think we have to sew up now, because it's time for Vespers and we've talked quite a long while, and I hope we've contributed something to people's understanding and knowledge, so that we will take questions on this as well. If any of you who are viewing this want to write in with comments or questions, fine, for David or myself. We're perfectly open to that and willing to respond. So thank you and God bless you.